Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to greet you. I'm Luisa Vargas, manager of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce in Mexico for the Western chapter, and welcome to our webinar, Leading a Successful Expansion, Turning Risk Intelligence into Action Across North America by AIMS International Talent Mexico and IEQ by LRQA. And it's my pleasure to introduce you our experts for today, Carlos Morales and Daniela Monsalvo. I'm pleased to welcome IEQ. IEQ is an assurance and supply chain due diligence platform built in ILR-QAS global expertise. It draws on more than 40,000 on-site audits per year across more than 110 countries, combining audit data, worker insights, and analytics into one connected system so that companies can identify risk earlier, prioritize effectively, and make informed decisions with confidence. Carlos Morales is a senior advisor Americas for IEQ, specializing in supply chain risk intelligence, human rights, and ESG due diligence. He works closely with multinational companies across North America to interpret audit-backed data, anticipate regulatory exposure, and strengthen responsible sourcing programs in complex high-risk environments. Today, Carlos will share perspective grounded in that real-world, boots-on-the-ground data and its impact on global supply chain. And we're also pleased to welcome AIMS International. AIMS is a global leadership advisory and executive search firm operating in over 50 countries, supporting organizations in navigating leadership transitions, governance design, and cross-border growth. With decades of experience working alongside boards, and executive teams, aims focus not only on talent placement, but on the leadership system that enables institutional resilience. Daniela Monsalvo is business manager at Northlead, member firm at AIMS International, advising organizations on leadership, talent, and governance challenge in context of expansion, transforming and cross-border complexity, working closely with executive teams, boards, and public-private stakeholders. Daniela brings a strong North America perspective, combining hands-on experience with a deep understanding on the human and organizational factors that shape sustainable growth. And today, Daniela will share perspectives in why governance clarity, representation, and execution alignment are structural components of successful market entry. Welcome, Daniela and Carlos, and thank you very much for sharing with us your expertise. The stage is all yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luisa. It's a pleasure to be here.
Perfect. Thank you, Luisa. And as Danielle mentioned, it is a pleasure to be here. I know there has been a lot of work and discussions here in the recent months, especially with the largest trade mission recorded in history. A lot of powerful discussions, and we will be diving into some relevant topics here today. Before we begin, I want to start with a rather hard question when it comes to expansion, and that is, why do expansion decisions fail? Most expansion decisions don't fail because they were wrong. They fail because the organization itself was not ready to support this structure. And right now, across Canada, Mexico, and United States, decisions are being made faster than ever. Trade policies are shifting, tariffs are moving, labor markets are tightening, and throughout all of this, suppliers are continuously changing. So what used to be as occasional in terms of pressure is now shifting towards constant pressure for teams and organizations. This causes leaders to have less time to think, validate their assumptions, or even align their teams. Global trade is shifting. What we're seeing here in the past year is that supply chains didn't get any safer, unfortunately. With this new context of integrating China's plus one strategy, post-China investment reallocations, things have gotten rearranged. Production has moved, nearshoring has accelerated, and in these discussions, Mexico has risen as a sourcing hub and a strategic partner within North America. But risk itself hasn't gone away. It has just changed form. When companies move from one region to another, they often assume that they are lowering their exposure. And this may be because it's closer in proximity. They may be familiar with that region. And as a result, maybe sometimes they are lowering their exposure. But what we're seeing very often is that they are typically trading one type of risk for another. Now, as Luisa mentioned, we do about 40,000 audits per year. We talk with a lot of responsible sourcing teams. And within our ecosystem, we sat down with 500 leaders across various different industries. And we asked them, what has been the biggest challenge last year for you? And by far, at 284 votes, it's tariffs. Because when tariffs move, procurement has to move fast. Compliance and responsible sourcing teams, on the other hand, aren't able to move at the same speed due to either fragmented data, manual processes, or siloed departments trying to combat this new issue at hand. Which leads to the second challenge we're also seeing is that teams are stretched. They're being asked to do more with less. Now, when I speak to responsible sourcing teams, and to be frank, this happens more often than not, is I speak to teams that are maybe 2 or 3 individuals and they're managing thousands, if not tens of thousands of suppliers. And when I jump on a call with them, it's not that they're lacking commitment with this new scope that's been presented in front of them. It's that they're lacking capacity because what used to be a 5-year sourcing plan is now being expected to be completed within a couple of weeks. The last challenge we've also notified is that regulations are not just increasing, but they're also overlapping. And standards and due diligence requirements may be interpreted differently depending on the jurisdictions you are sourcing or operating in. So creating these defensible reports, whether it's regulatory specific or if it's for a stakeholder, is becoming more and more complicated. So in 2025, costs have shifted, teams are stretched, regulations have tightened. We followed this up with a question which it's a simple question, but very heavy loaded. And that is, what would most improve your supply chains right now, looking at 2026? And surprisingly, the answer wasn't more audits. It wasn't more policies. The number one response was AI-powered automation, technology. That's what we see as a signal. Leaders are not asking for more work, they're asking for smarter work. They know that risk is increasing, that volatility isn't slowing down anytime soon, but they are also very aware that they cannot scale their teams at the same speed. So they're looking for leverage. And how do you build this leverage aside from technology? They've also highlighted that greater audit and data sharing is really on the horizon. And that's because moving forward doesn't occur without us working together with our suppliers, our vendors, even our competitors to better navigate this uncertainty. Echoes that third point, which is centralized systems and integrations. So what it tells us is the pain itself isn't about visibility, it's about fragmentation. The data may exist, the audits are there, we're conducting them, we're doing our due diligence, the insights are also there, they're just not connected. So we followed this up with asking them, where are they actually putting their money? Where are they investing in the next 12 to 16 months to make sure that as organizations, we become more resilient? And it echoed those points. Better technology, audit and assessment programs, data programs in order to ensure they have defensible evidence for their due diligence, and then having a continuous improvement in education and enablement of those specific suppliers. So this is a full cycle of continued business continuity and improvement of those processes. So they're not abandoning audits, they're not abandoning their people, They're building a three-layer defense system where they first predict risk earlier, verify on the ground, and then strengthen their suppliers directly. So for companies operating across North America, the question is no longer, are supply chains risky for the specific product or commodity? The real question is, are we structured to manage the risk at this speed without losing credibility? Because let's face it, there are no simple or safe alternatives when it comes to global sourcing. Every region carries risk. The only difference is the type of risk you're choosing, and then if, of course, you're prepared to manage it. So I will be diving into what we're seeing firsthand at these factories, at the sites within North America from the audits that we are conducting on a given year. Let's start with the United States first. The United States remains one of the most structured governance environments in the world. But structure today means additional expectations and scrutiny for organizations. Now, in the past year, we have seen immigration enforcement has increased. Shipments of goods continue to be detained at the border due to lack of defensible evidence of due diligence. And in a country which has historically been deemed safe of forced labor risk, it's very much present. And in fact, has gone up over 33% just in the past year alone. Now, what we're talking about here today, it's not theoretical risk. This is construction, agriculture, hospitality industries scrambling due to labor shortages, increasing the usage of labor agencies to fill gaps. This is millions of dollars of products being stopped at the border, causing revenue to be delayed, and even worse, reputation to be questioned. In the US, the risk isn't chaos, it's accountability. But accountability without preparation becomes expensive. And we will be diving into what those financial impacts look like if not taken seriously. But let's continue to wrap up North America. Let's dive into Canada, and then we'll go into Mexico. Now, Canada, it operates in a highly stable and political regulatory environment. If we look at Canada itself, something important has changed, and that's migrant worker risk has shifted from medium to high. We've also seen humane treatment indicators worsened, edging towards high risk, and agriculture is absorbing a large part of that pressure. This matters because Canada is often perceived as low risk. But what this data shows us is not instability. It's actually vulnerability within specific labor programs and systems. Temporary foreign migrant worker programs, seasonal agricultural labor, housing and working conditions. These are not systemic failures of governance. They are pressure points within growth sectors. So companies operating within agriculture, oil, energy, manufacturing expands under these labor constraints. If your supply chain touches those sectors, your exposure just increased, even if the country's overall reputation hasn't changed. Now, we know Canada is strengthening their transparency requirements. We see this through their climate disclosures, through the SB 211 forced labor bill. Supply chain accountability is becoming public facing. When transparency becomes mandatory, what used to be considered internal risk now becomes external exposure. So for Canada itself and for organizations, the pressure is less about border seizures. It's more about reputational credibility. If you say you are responsible, you must prove it. Now let's talk about Mexico. We know it's central to the nearshoring conversation as we talked on the first slide. It's a country that represents growth, manufacturing expansion, agricultural scaling. It's presented itself as a strategic partner within North America and a rising source hub. But when we look at the data, and not just the headlines, the signals are clear. It echoes that supply chain vulnerabilities remain critical around labor, health, and safety. What Mexico shows us is not isolated risk, it's pressure at the site level, at the factories, the labor conditions, the protocols, the machine safety, the transparency gaps that we are noticing. Now, Mexico is an opportunity, but an opportunity without that site level visibility becomes a liability for you and your teams. The data itself isn't telling us to avoid Mexico, and I don't want that to get misinterpreted. It's actually telling us that with growth comes structure, and it requires this. Because if you don't have structure in place, risk escalates quietly until it becomes public. Now let's zoom out and circle back to what North America as a whole we have seen. And we talked about when risk comes public. Just in the past year alone, we have seen over 5,000 adverse incidents across regional suppliers in North America. That's the cold, hard truth. It's happening inside factories, farms, processing facilities, the regions we're operating in. And here's the issue. When a company only evaluates risk at the country level, they miss all of this, all of these headlines, all of these early warning risk signals. Now, what I hear most is companies saying, hey, we've got this covered. We have an Excel sheet, 3 different teams updating this on a weekly basis, or, we're aiming towards this large transformation project, but we're firefighting X, Y, and Z that happened 2 months ago. But I really want to reemphasize why it is important to take action now and truly pressure test your procurement and responsible sourcing programs. Because when issues at specific sites or vendors you work with go unseen, they escalate. And what happens when they escalate? They trigger investigations, they trigger detentions, withhold release orders, and when a WRO hits, the cost is not just marginal. It's a multi-million-dollar exposure, resulting in lost revenue and canceled orders, legal fees, reputational damage, and now having to re-engineer your supply chains under pressure and additional scrutiny. Now, more often, the most expensive part of this is not the fine itself, it's the disruption that this causes within organizations. So the takeaway here isn't that North America is high risk. It's that if you're operating within North America, you have to hold yourself to a high accountability. Accountability requires visibility, which brings us to the core issue. Do we as organizations have the right data? Is it structured in a way that it's easy to interpret? And then looking at this data, are we able to identify risk early, prioritize correctly, and build the resilience before enforcement forces us to do so? Now, the critical piece here, when we're talking about North America as a whole, we've covered risk, we've covered exposure, and the costs associated with this. But the real shift isn't volatility, it's the speed in which things are happening. Expectations are moving faster, and decisions are happening in compressed timeframes. Decisions need to be grounded in high-quality data and insights, along with teams that are structured to move together with agility. Now, we've explored what's happening in the market, and now I have the pleasure to hand this over to Daniela, who will talk about how organizations can prepare themselves to lead in these global discussions. Because insight informs, but leadership executes. And that's where Ames will bring a critical discussion to this session.
Thank you, Carlos. That was very enlightening, and I think you posed a very important question. Do organizations have the right data? And I think that everyone in the room will agree with me here on how desperate we might feel at times for more information as things develop around us so fastly. But at the same time, we end up feeling bombarded, and quite exhausted to process it all. So having the right sources is really our differentiator here. Carlos has shown us where exposure clusters. Now I would like to explore how leadership systems respond to that exposure before operations begin. So let me walk you through what landing with purpose means in our 30 plus years of combined experience. And the first bias I would like to address here is that leadership is not a soft factor in expansion. It is the primary risk absorption mechanism that you and your leading teams will have to either absorb or amplify those risks. When I talk about leadership and expansion, I am not referring to personality, charisma, or management styles. Leadership readiness in this context has a lot more to do with your governance clarity, your decision velocity, and the accountability structures that you'll have in place. Now, whilst a good risk management system should answer where is risk accumulating, you as a leader become accountable for identifying and managing those risks from destabilizing your execution once you are on the ground. Think about this. Before organizations as a whole enter a market operationally, you as a leader are already absorbing risk signals and shaping assumptions in every early conversation that you are having. Whatever infrastructure you have in place will keep you from doing that alone. And what we have seen in multiple expansion processes is that leadership readiness unfolds across three growing phases: your early exposure and decision framing, your leadership and governance alignment, and the operational grounding that you have and how that will reflect in trusted partnerships. Quick disclaimer here, first and second phases have nothing to do with hiring, okay? So you know that there, as Carlos mentioned, we just had the largest trade mission on record between Canada and Mexico. And a very wise leader said something that really stuck with me. He said that the first mistake that organizations make is assuming that country risk is greater than it actually is. And I think that what he meant by that is that we often spend more time fearing external exposure than examining internal alignment. So let's talk about early exposure and decision framing. This takes place before you even enter the market. It actually begins at the leadership table, and it's all about how exposure will be framed. Now, Carlos gave us a very good overview of what the North American landscape is looking like right now, though that might change every 15 minutes. But you will definitely find in Canada an innovation and regulatory test bed, or you might look into the US as your launching net for scalability and export velocity, and Mexico will definitely offer you growth corridors. As Carlos very well pointed to, exposure in North America is not evenly distributed. That is what we're seeing with risk. So decision framing will require mapping your value to the right context. And in this context, questions around the leadership table will have a lot to do with what risks are we willing to absorb? Which ones are we structurally prepared or unprepared for? And most importantly, who owns those decisions once we are in motion? So ensuring that your executive teams are aligned is not optional and has to be done before capital is deployed. And your role as a leader during this stage will be to test those assumptions, to understand where exposure truly sits, and to evaluate the governance implications of every move. Now, after the first handshakes, you are ready to go into the market, and for that you will require leadership alignment and governance maturity. Now, I want to re-emphasize this. Execution resilience is never accidental. It is structural. And the question here is not only can we enter the market, but now that we are ready and determined to do so, Are we entering it with aligned leadership that will reflect into credible representation? In cross-border expansion, relationships are not networking tools only. They are infrastructure. You may not create that infrastructure without credibility. And especially at this stage, credibility will travel through people. What I am trying to say here is that who carries your name will shape how your value is perceived in these critical stages. Now, we're talked about who represents you. And on phase 3, it is all about the system that surrounds that representation. Or in very simple words, who owns execution once commitments have been made? Now talent comes in, but not necessarily in the form of headcount. You are now shifting to creating tangible infrastructure. And here is where partnerships will matter most. And you now have the opportunity of truly becoming a local enabler. So your teams on the ground, regardless of size, will now need a local leadership calibration between the new local operation that's developing and the headquarters, defined ownership in their everyday realities, and both the decision velocity and the execution resilience that will now be built and reflected into your leadership systems. So what does a successful risk to leadership roadmap look like? If we step back for a second, what we're aiming to build here is not a one-size-fits-all model. In reality, it is a sequence of accountability. So you start by asking yourself, are we framing our risk exposure correctly? This will mean engaging with the right partners who can decode regional dynamics for you, who can truly become those local enablers that will bring back contextual intelligence that will help you translate dialogue into informed decisions. And then you ask yourself, can the team in front of us translate global strategy into real local regulatory logic? Can they navigate relationship ecosystems with proved credibility? And can we as a whole convert access into structured decision momentum? And finally, as Carlos said, you're going to be pressure tested many times, and your operational model will require asking yourself, where should governance be shared and where must it be centralized? Who carries execution authority locally and how is that embedded? And which partnerships will become strategic extensions of me, and how is accountability framed in the everyday execution? A lot of questions, food for thought here. So as Carlos and I continue participating in early expansion conversations, we realize that risk concentrates in 3 pressure zones. Once more, I want you to think of your leadership systems as the thermometer on the ground that will determine whether those risks are amplified or structurally absorbed. So let's talk about reputational risk. The first thing I want to highlight is that it does not begin externally. In fact, it begins when local execution contradicts your brand promise. Remember this, global credibility is always tested locally. So when your governance standards, or really any part of your infrastructure, appear fragmented across your different locations, what the market will perceive is inconsistency. And who is actually the first line to experience that inconsistency? It is not your clients, it is not your stakeholders, it is your own teams. We have seen companies that have a very solid market entry plan, but internally, governance standards are interpreted differently across geographies, accountability between the headquarters and local teams is blurred, and all of this causes internal confidence to erode in such an important stage. What I am trying to say here is that risk does not only live in supply chains. In fact, it lives in the everyday execution friction. So another takeaway that we have for you is that every market encodes risk differently. What might feel acceptable in one market could be perceived as institutional weakness in another. But we have also seen expansion done differently. In fact, I'll share a very quick story here. I remembered supporting a company that was preparing to scale aggressively in a new market. And for this, their number one priority was not even starting with headcount. It was standards. So as a first step, we sat down with every stakeholder that would influence their operational success locally and asking them, how would our governance principles need to be translated here in order to be successful? So governance ownership was explicit from day one, and most importantly, local execution was not a pilot. It was brand defining, and their teams truly sensed that. Now, the second zone is talent, and not retention in the HR sense, but structural disengagement. The first deal breaker here, expansion destabilizes your teams when they feel operational and not strategic. You might have a very strong commercial logic, but I have seen local teams firsthand that quickly demotivate when they sense that they are here to execute and not to shape things. Cultural narrative will also matter a lot during this stage. You might think it best at first instance to roll out a global standard talent strategy. But if you do not take into account the local realities of your teams, they will most probably end up feeling that the agenda was imposed, it did not take them into consideration, and that it was not co-created. So integrating local leaders into your strategy early and intentionally has to be done, as they will be the ones who validate and get back to you with the insights, the feedback, the firsthand realities that will allow you to reach local maturity. Now, last but not least, execution as a risk. And this is again where speed all in all with the operation will pressure test your architectures. We've seen companies that move fast. We know there is a lot of momentum going on right now in the region, signing partnerships, opening operations, hiring teams, but the underlying design is not necessarily ready to support that. How does this look like in your everyday reality? And let me know if some of these pain points might connect with you. Providers don't really speak to each other. They're not coordinated across functions. Your local partners, who are supposed to be your eyes on the ground, report upward but not laterally. So you end up lacking a truthful insight information. And if your decision authority remains centralized, that will not allow you to react quickly and calibrate what has to be done. We always tell our clients, when you go into a new market, you have to think as a startup, you have to act fast and make mistakes even faster. So how is this done right? Make sure that local partners carry clear accountability, that your transition modes once you enter the market are phased and not improvised. How can you support this? Reporting frameworks, escalation frameworks, make sure that they are designed before crisis requires them. I want you to think about what most companies overlook when measuring a successful expansion. Do not only measure financial performance. Look at your execution stability. That is usually the best pulse check that you will have for checking how scalable you actually are. So, in a wrap up, our goal today is to show you where risk concentrates, which Carlos has done very well, and I look to support you in exploring how leadership determines what happens next. So I want you to think as talent as your anchor, and risk intelligence as the translator in your expansion journey. As we conclude this session, and thank you to everyone joining, I want to take a moment to remind ourselves, bridges are not always built because times are easy. They are built because leaders like you choose continuity over noise. So today, more than ever, we admire those who remain steady, those who believe in institutional collaboration, and the strong belief that progress is stronger than disruption. So I'm going to hand this over to Carlos. It has been a pleasure speaking with you. And once again, let me just remind you, the story of our corridor is and will continue to be defined by the thousands of leaders who show up every day to invest, innovate, and build. Thank you. I think, yes.
Thank you, Danielle. And that was very well said. I think change starts with us, and this is how we move forward is through our collaboration. So I appreciate everyone attending today's session. I hope it was informative and valuable, echoing a lot of the discussions that occurred throughout the trade mission. As two takeaways before we move on to the question and answer section of today, I just want to highlight that we will be sharing a risk and leadership playbook, which highlights a lot of the topics, risks, and challenges, solutions that we have gone over in today's webinar. Here, all consolidated in a very nice playbook for you. This will be shared via email. If for some reason you do not receive this, please don't hesitate to reach out either to CANCHAM, Ames, or myself at EIQ in order to make sure that you get one available. On the right-hand side, you will also see that we do have one-on-one strategy sessions. If you are unable to get all of your questions answered on today's call, or you have any other topics, things that you would like to discuss, we would like to present the value of scheduling a session with Daniela and myself to have a structured conversation around these topics. But last piece here, I will leave you with our contact information. If you do need to reach out, please don't hesitate to do so. Happy to connect on LinkedIn as well. And last but not least, I want to thank you all for joining. Now I'll open up the floor for questions, unless Luisa, you have any comments.
Wow, thank you very much. I want to share, when we were in our round calls for the preparation of this webinar, we put on the table many sectors, energy, mining, agriculture, manufacture. Well, we finally arrived to this statement that our biggest supply chain risk isn't compliance failure, as we said. It is the migrant labor exposure and the governance conditions. So for me, it's very important to point that, because the capacity of IQ, the capacity frames to stating the data for very specific terms is huge. But we decided to take this because we are living in an uncertainty, continuous uncertainty. The last year and this year, it's moving on very quickly. So we have to take care of our decisions very closely. As you said, there are clear risks. And I think that we call uncertainty, this term has numbers, has names, has data. So what type of information do we want, and how I can guarantee to have the most certain data to take my decisions? And as a leader, the impact of my organization in my supply chain. So for me, that's very, very important to note. And how is North America regions moving on? How is the growth corridors function? So, and I thank you very much, because all this data was leading us to this statement. So how do we can practice this? By now we have a specific question. As you said, we will be closer, and we will be connected in our email and in our cell phone, and all this information we will share for you. I don't know if someone wants to ask anything, if you want to give us like final comments or like your perspective in these two themes, so we can maybe close our webinar, if nothing else more.
Thank you,
Absolutely.
Lisa.
Don't be shy. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. We would be happy to answer them. I did just share my screen one more time, so you do have our contact information available in case you would want to reach out separately. Daniela, I'll pass it over to you if you have any more comments.
I think it's a lot of information to process. The main takeaway here that I want to share with you is that, we've also done it. Aims, we always work on strengthening the expansion muscle, I'll put it that way. So we have lived this firsthand, and we know that that's something that EIQ is highly committed towards, providing firsthand information. So I think that for all of you this will resonate. It's not only about the speed, it's about making sure that your infrastructure from all pillars is there and is being done right. So yes, think long term, but also make sure that the foundations are there and are ready. And I see a question, Luis. I'll hand it over to you.
Looks
Please. Well, I'll read it for you. Mariana Cervantes, thank you. Thank you for your comment. Your data was mainly focused in physical supply chain. Do you have any pointers in its supply chain that you could share with us?
so. The way I'm reading this question, and Mariana, feel free to correct me if I'm mistaken, but so what we're looking at is more so IT related, maybe service or vendors that provide services within your supply chain. And for typically those types of relationships, we would monitor them the same way as a factory or a site. We take into consideration the specific services that they are being provided and then the risk associated with this. Now, specific insights, happy to have a discussion afterwards where we can dive a little bit more deep into your specific supply chain, the topics that you're on that are on your radar, and how this is being shaped within North America. So please, Mariana, don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you, Carlos. We have another question by RCG. I think it's Carlos Redfern. I don't see. Question to Ames. What insights would you have from your expansion into Canada? Thank you.
Thank you, Luisa. I always love sharing this story because, as I mentioned very proudly, we did it the way around. We expanded to Canada 6 years ago, and it's been quite a ride. Remember, it was the pandemic, so we almost sounded crazy doing expansion of an executive recruiting firm when everyone was downsizing. But that did, in fact, give us a lot of powerful insights. The first one, as I mentioned, and I do highlight this a lot, is the credibility part. This really matters. Make sure that you are very much aligned to the market, you read it and you understand it correctly. You need to become a local player and not just from the business perspective. So surrounding yourself with the right ecosystems, understanding every tier of the supply chain from your stakeholders, your clients, everyone internally, that will give you a lot of strength and it will give you a pulse check of what is going on. So act as a local enabler, participate in the ecosystems. CANCHAM is a very powerful one for those who are looking into Mexico. We have seen that with companies going the way around. Be a shaper in the conversation. I will be very brief about that, but it's been quite a ride for us, definitely.
Thank you very much, Danny. Yeah, I'm very honorable that expansion. And what kind of expansion? Because you are huge and you are continually reshaping yourself. So that's enormous. Uh, well, by now, I think there are no more questions, but I really do want to thank you very much, Carlos and Daniela, for sharing with us this topic of great impact for our business, of course, and for our bilateral and the relations in North America. So thank you very much. We are so grateful for your expertise in sharing this. And well, if we don't have any more, as we said, we are going to share with us the presentation and the data of our Carlos and Daniela. And thank you very much. we'll follow up directly. And if thank you for your presence also for the attendees and your time today. And we wish you an excellent day. Thank you very much and see you on the next webinar. Thank you very much, Carlos and Daniela, and
Thank
our
you for
attendees.
having us, Luisa. It's been a pleasure. Thank you
Thank
all.
you all.
Have a nice day. Bye bye.
Take care, everyone. Have a good one.
Ciao, ciao.